Los Angeles, LAX, October 1971, Terminal B, Gate 14. The kind of afternoon that Los Angeles produces in October. Bright and indifferent, the sun doing nothing to acknowledge that anything significant is about to happen inside one of the most traveled airports in the world. 14,000 passengers move through LAX on an average afternoon. They carry bags and boarding passes and the specific distracted energy of people in transit, people who are between places, people who are not yet where they are going and are no longer where they were. Nobody pays attention to anybody else. That is the unwritten contract of airports. You are invisible here. You are in motion. You are between. On this particular afternoon in October 1971, two men are about to board the same flight to San Francisco. One of them has a ticket for seat 14A. The other man is already sitting in it. The man in seat 14A was a United States Navy SEAL. His name is not important to this story. What is important is what he was. 6 feet 3 inches tall, 200 kilograms of muscle and mass that had been built not in gyms, but in the specific conditions that the United States military produces when it decides to create something that can operate in any environment, under any conditions, against any opposition, and survive. He was wearing a black tank top that fit him the way tank tops fit men, whose arms are individually larger than most people's entire upper bodies. Which is to say, it did not fit him at all, but had long since made peace with the situation. He was wearing green military trousers and black shoes. His hair was cut short, military short. The specific cut that says, "I have submitted my appearance to a system, and the system does not negotiate." He was sitting in 14A, with his knees pressed against the seat in front of him and his shoulders extending into the aisle on one side and into the seat beside him on the other. And he was reading a newspaper that he had folded into quarters the way people fold newspapers when they are reading them in confined spaces, holding it in one massive hand with the casual authority of someone who has decided where he is going to sit and has finished making that decision and does not anticipate any further discussion on the subject. He had not looked at his boarding pass. His boarding pass said 14B. He had sat in 14A because 14A was the aisle seat, and he needed the aisle seat because his frame required the aisle seat, and because, in his experience, the kind of person who objected to him sitting wherever he chose to sit was the kind of person who, after a brief assessment of the available options, decided not to object after all. This assessment had never been wrong, not once, not in 32 years of existing in a body that generated this specific category of spatial authority. Bruce Lee arrived at Gate 14 at 2:47 in the afternoon. He was carrying a small brown leather duffel bag and a boarding pass that said Seat 14A. He was wearing a dark mandarin collar jacket and black trousers and black cloth shoes. And he moved through the terminal the way he moved through every space he entered, with the flat, certain economy of someone for whom every step is exactly what it needs to be and nothing more. He was 5 feet 7 inches tall. He weighed 138 pounds. He had been in Los Angeles for 3 days for a meeting with a producer at Warner Brothers about a project that would, if the meeting had gone the way he hoped, change the trajectory of his career in American film in ways that the American film industry was not yet prepared to understand. The meeting had gone well. Not perfectly, but well enough that he was returning to San Francisco with something he had not had when he arrived, which was momentum. He boarded the aircraft, moved through the narrow aisle, reached row 14, looked at the seat number on the overhead panel, looked at the man sitting in 14A, looked at his own boarding pass, and stopped. He stood in the aisle beside row 14 with his duffel bag in his left hand and his boarding pass in his right hand, and looked at the man in 14A with the expression he brought to every problem he encountered, which was the expression of someone beginning the process of understanding what the problem actually is before deciding what it requires. The man in 14A looked up from his newspaper. He looked at Bruce Lee, the way men of his dimensions look at men of Bruce Lee's dimensions, which is with the specific mild assessment of someone who has already completed the calculation and found the result uninteresting. He looked at the boarding pass in Bruce Lee's hand. He looked at the seat number on the overhead panel. He looked back at Bruce Lee. Then he looked back at his newspaper. He said without looking up, "Find another seat." His voice was deep, flat, carrying the specific authority of someone who has given orders his entire adult life and has never once had to repeat them. It was not a hostile voice. It was something more unsettling than hostile. It was a voice that had no category for the possibility of non-compliance. It was a voice that existed in a world where what it said happened because it said it. And the gap between those two things was so small and so consistently reliable that the voice had forgotten the gap existed. Bruce Lee did not move. He stood in the aisle with his duffel bag and his boarding pass and looked at the man in 14A. "That's my seat," Bruce said. Quiet, conversational, the tone of someone stating a fact that requires no elaboration and no performance. "Seat 14A, that's what my boarding pass says." The man in 14A did not look up from his newspaper. "Find another seat," he said again. Same tone, same flatness. The specific flatness of someone who has said a thing and considers the thing said, and the matter therefore concluded. Bruce Lee did not find another seat. He stood in the aisle. Around him, the aircraft continued its pre-departure routine. Other passengers moved past him, excusing themselves, finding their seats, stowing their bags in the overhead compartments. The flight attendant at the front of the cabin was performing the specific organized calm of someone managing the boarding process and choosing to not yet acknowledge the specific situation developing in row 14. Bruce looked at the man in 14A. He looked at his boarding pass. He looked at the seat number. He said, "I'm going to need you to move to your assigned seat." The man in 14A folded his newspaper. Not slowly, not dramatically, but with the deliberate precision of someone putting something down because something else has required his full attention for the first time. He turned his head and looked at Bruce Lee fully for the first time. What he saw was a small man in a dark jacket holding a duffel bag and a boarding pass. He performed the calculation he always performed in such moments. The rapid automatic assessment of threat level that his training had made involuntary, and the result was what the result always was when someone of Bruce Lee's visible dimensions stood in front of someone of his visible dimensions. The result was 0. He looked at Bruce Lee the way a mountain looks at weather, not with contempt exactly, with the specific indifference of something that has never been moved by the thing it is looking at, and cannot produce the neural pathway required to imagine being moved by it. "Move me," he said. 2 words, not a question, not a threat. A statement of available options. The specific statement of a man who has just offered someone a menu that contains only one item and is waiting to see if they are going to order it. What happened next took less than 4 seconds, but those 4 seconds were the 4 seconds that every person in the surrounding rows would describe for the rest of their lives with the specific precision of people trying to reproduce something their eyes delivered to their brains, and their brains initially refused to accept. The man in 14A reached up. His hand, which was the size of a dinner plate, and had been trained to perform actions that the human body is not designed to perform without training, moved toward Bruce Lee's throat. Not slowly. The motion was fast, the practiced fast of someone for whom physical action is the primary vocabulary. His fingers closed around the front of Bruce Lee's collar, the dark mandarin collar jacket bunching in his grip, and he pulled. It was the kind of pull that comes from 200 kilograms of developed muscle executing a motion it has practiced thousands of times. The pull that says, "This conversation is over, and I am ending it, and there is nothing in the available inventory of things that can be done about that." It was the pull of someone who has never once had a pull like this, failed to produce the intended result. The newspaper fell from his other hand and landed on the floor of the aisle with the specific dead sound of something that was being held and is no longer being held, the sound of an afternoon that has just changed direction entirely. Bruce Lee's right hand moved. This is the part that the witnesses struggled to describe consistently, because the hand moved at a speed that the human eye processes differently from normal speed, the way the eye processes the motion of a hummingbird's wings, not as a sequence of positions, but as a blur that begins in one place and arrives in another with no visible middle. One witness in 15B said later that he did not see Bruce Lee's hand move. He saw the man in 14A's arm begin its motion, and then he saw something different happening to that arm, and the transition between those two things was invisible. What happened in the invisible transition was this. Bruce Lee's right hand found the man's wrist. 2 fingers and a thumb, positioned with the surgical precision of someone who has spent 20 years learning exactly where to position 2 fingers and a thumb on a human wrist to produce a specific and reliable result. And then Bruce Lee's hand rotated. Not dramatically, not with visible effort, a small, contained rotation, perhaps 45 degrees, that applied force in the one direction that the human wrist joint is not designed to resist when the arm attached to it is extended and the shoulder attached to that is carrying 200 kilograms of forward momentum. The rotation did not stop the motion. It redirected it. The man's arm continued its arc, but the arc it continued was not the arc it had been on. It was a different arc, one that his shoulder had not authorized, and his elbow was now negotiating at a speed that was producing information his pain receptors were forwarding to his brain with some urgency. The man in 14A found himself in a position he had never been in. His arm was extended, his wrist was locked, and the force he was applying against the lock was producing not the result he intended, but a result he was receiving as information about the structural limits of the joint his wrist happened to be. He could not pull forward. He could not pull back. He could not rotate because the rotation had already been performed, and the new position of his wrist was the position that prevented further rotation. He was, in the most precise mechanical sense, stopped, not by strength opposing his strength, by geometry opposing his momentum, by the specific and complete understanding of how a human arm generates force, and how that force can be received and redirected by someone who understands it better than the arm does. He looked at his own arm. Then he looked at the small man holding it. The expression on his face during those 2 seconds was described by the witness in 15C as the expression of a man who has just discovered that the floor he has been standing on his entire life is not the floor he believed it was. Not pain, not fear, something more fundamental. The specific expression of a foundational assumption encountering a fact that the assumption cannot accommodate. On the floor of the aisle beside row 14, the newspaper lay open to whatever page it had been on when it fell. Its headlines announcing the ordinary concerns of October 1971 to an audience of no one. The world outside the aircraft continuing its business while inside row 14, something else entirely was being settled. The flight attendant arrived. She had been moving toward row 14 since the moment the man's hand had left the newspaper, had covered the distance from the front of the cabin in the quick, purposeful walk of someone who is trained to de-escalate before things become the kind of things that appear in aviation incident reports. She was young, perhaps 24, and she had been working for United Airlines for 2 years and had handled delayed passengers and overbooked rows and the occasional raised voice. But she had not handled this, whatever this was, this specific tableau of a very large man's arm extended in the grip of a very small man's 2 fingers in row 14 of a flight to San Francisco. She said, "Gentlemen, please." The way flight attendants say please when please is doing all of the work that please can do. She put her hand on the man's shoulder, not on Bruce Lee's, because Bruce Lee was not the variable that required management in this situation, and she said it again, "Please." Bruce Lee looked at the flight attendant. He released the wrist. The release was as controlled as the grip had been, a deliberate, specific uncoupling that left the man's arm free to return to whatever position it chose to return to. The man withdrew his arm. He looked at it. He opened and closed his hand twice. Then he looked at Bruce Lee with an expression that had traveled a considerable distance from where it had started, when he first looked up from his newspaper and seen a small man in a dark jacket holding a boarding pass. The flight attendant turned to the man in 14A. She was choosing her words with the specific care of someone who understands that the words she is about to say are going to land in a particular way, and she wants to control that landing as precisely as possible. She said, "Sir, I need to let you know who you're sitting next to." The man looked at her. His expression was the expression of someone who is listening because the person speaking has earned the right to be listened to by the events of the last 30 seconds. Not because he has conceded anything, not because he is afraid, but because something has happened that has opened a channel of information that was not open before, and he is now receiving information through it. "This gentleman," the flight attendant said, with a small gesture toward Bruce Lee that managed to be both professional and precise, "is Bruce Lee." She paused. The pause was not for drama. It was the pause of someone waiting to see if the name has landed. The man in 14A looked at Bruce Lee. The name was traveling through his recognition system, finding the pathways where Bruce Lee existed as information, the television appearances, the photographs, the specific cultural presence that Bruce Lee occupied in 1971 in the United States. The man who moved faster than cameras could capture. The man who had demonstrated things in front of audiences that those audiences had been unable to fully describe afterward. The man whose reputation in martial arts circles was the specific reputation of someone about whom the people who actually understood what they were talking about did not speak in the language of exaggeration, but in the language of simple description, because the simple description was already beyond what exaggeration could improve. "He is one of the most accomplished martial arts practitioners in the world," the flight attendant continued, still in the same controlled, professional tone. "He is a world-renowned martial artist, an actor, and a philosopher of physical movement whose expertise is recognized across every discipline that studies these things." She paused again. "His boarding pass says 14A. The man in 14A sat with this information for a moment. Around him, the aircraft continued its pre-departure routine. The overhead compartments were being closed. The safety card was being removed from the seat pocket by the passenger in 13A. The engines were producing the low preliminary hum that precedes the specific transition from stationary to mobile that is one of the defining sounds of air travel. The man in 14A looked at his own hand again, The hand that had reached for Bruce Lee's collar and had found itself in a position it had never found itself in before. He looked at Bruce Lee, who was standing in the aisle with his duffel bag and his boarding pass, and the expression he always had, which was the expression of someone who is entirely present and entirely certain and entirely unaffected by anything that has occurred in the last 4 minutes. Not triumphant, not performing anything, just present, just certain, just waiting for the situation to resolve itself into what it was always going to resolve itself into, which was Bruce Lee sitting in seat 14A. Something moved through the man in 14A's expression. It was not a dramatic movement. It was small, interior, the specific small interior movement of a man who has spent his entire life in an understanding of the world that has just been revised by 2 fingers and a wrist and 45 degrees of rotation. He folded what remained of the newspaper and placed it in the seat pocket in front of him. He unbuckled his seatbelt, and then, without a word, without any of the performance that lesser men would have deployed in this moment to recover something from a situation that had produced a result they had not anticipated, he stood up. Standing, he was enormous. The overhead compartment was at his eye level. The aisle that Bruce Lee occupied without difficulty accommodated him only by requiring him to turn slightly sideways. He looked at Bruce Lee. He said 2 words. "Excuse me." Not apology, exactly. Something more precise than apology. Acknowledgement. The specific acknowledgement of a man who has encountered something he did not expect and is deciding, in the private honesty that the most serious people sometimes access in unguarded moments, to acknowledge it. He moved past Bruce Lee into the aisle. He walked toward the back of the aircraft. He found an empty seat in row 22 and sat in it and did not look back. Bruce Lee placed his duffel bag in the overhead compartment above 14A. He sat down. He buckled his seatbelt. He looked out the window at the LAX tarmac, at the other aircraft lined up for departure, at the ground crew moving equipment in the specific organized patterns of people who have performed the same tasks enough times that the tasks have become a kind of choreography. His expression did not change. His breathing did not change. His hands rested on the armrests of seat 14A with the same steadiness they had possessed in the boarding gate, in the terminal, in the Warner Brothers meeting, in every moment of every day that Bruce Lee moved through the world in the way he moved through it, which was completely and without residue, each moment fully inhabited and then released, nothing carried forward that did not need to be carried forward. The flight attendant who had intervened in row 14 passed his seat on her way to the front of the cabin. She glanced at him. He looked up at her. He said, "Thank you." 2 words. Quiet. Genuine. She said, "Of course, Mr. Lee," and continued forward. The newspaper that had fallen from the man's hand still lay on the floor of the aisle where it had landed. A different flight attendant picked it up during the pre-departure cabin check, folded it neatly, and placed it in the seat pocket of row 14. It sat there for the duration of the flight, unread, its headlines carrying the ordinary concerns of October 1971 to San Francisco and back, never knowing it had witnessed something. The aircraft pushed back from gate 14 at 3:15. It taxied to runway 25L and held for 4 minutes while a 747 from Japan Airlines completed its landing roll. Then the engines spooled to full power and the aircraft accelerated down the runway and lifted into the October Los Angeles afternoon and climbed through the marine layer into the specific blue that exists above the marine layer and that LAX departures encounter as they turn north toward San Francisco. In seat 14A, Bruce Lee looked out the window as the city fell away beneath him. Los Angeles from the air is a grid a vast organized grid of streets and buildings that extends in every direction to the mountains and the ocean. A city built on the assumption that space is available and will continue to be available. A city that has never had to make the compromises that older cities make. He looked at it the way he looked at everything, with complete attention, with the specific quality of someone for whom looking is also understanding, for whom seeing a thing is also knowing what it contains. The city below him was the city where he had spent 3 days trying to convince people who controlled access to the largest film market in the world that what he represented was worth representing. The meeting at Warner Brothers had gone well. Not perfectly, but well enough. And that was sufficient. Sufficient was always enough when sufficient was what was available, and the alternative was less than sufficient. He was returning to San Francisco with momentum and a boarding pass that said 14A and the specific satisfaction of someone who has sat in the seat they were assigned and found it to be exactly the seat it was supposed to be. In row 22, the man who had been in seat 14A was looking at his own hand, opening it, closing it. The wrist felt normal. There was no pain, no lasting effect, no physical evidence of what had occurred in the aisle of the aircraft 40 minutes earlier. But something was there that had not been there before, some piece of information that the wrist had received and transmitted, and that the brain was still processing, still turning over, still trying to fit into the existing architecture of what he understood about force and resistance and the relationship between size and capability. He was a man who had trained his body for years to be the most capable physical instrument available to him, and he had just discovered that capability was not the word he had been thinking it was. Capability, he was understanding for the first time at 32,000 feet above the California coast, was not about the magnitude of force you could generate. It was about the precision with which you could apply it. It was about understanding the structure of the problem so completely that the solution required not more force but less, not more mass but more knowledge, not the overwhelming of resistance but the redirection of it. He had spent his adult life accumulating force. The small man in 14A had spent his accumulating understanding, and understanding, he was discovering, was the variable he had not budgeted for. He looked out his own window at the California coast, the Pacific stretching westward toward a horizon that was also the edge of what he could see from where he was sitting, and he thought about 2 fingers and a thumb, and 45 degrees of rotation, and the newspaper that was now in a seat pocket somewhere in the rows behind him, and he thought about all the rooms he had walked into in his life, and all the calculations he had performed, and all the results those calculations had produced, and how not one of those results had prepared him for row 14 of a United Airlines flight to San Francisco in October 1971. Bruce Lee arrived in San Francisco at 4:47. He collected his duffel bag from the overhead compartment of seat 14A and walked up the aisle and through the jetway and into the terminal and out through the arrivals exit and into a waiting car and was driven to his home and arrived in time for dinner with his family. He did not mention the incident on the aircraft to anyone. Not to Linda, not to his students, not to the friends and colleagues who would have found the story interesting, who would have asked questions, who would have wanted details. There was nothing to mention. A man had been sitting in his seat. The man had been reading a newspaper. The man had attempted something. The attempt had not produced the result the man intended. The man had moved to another seat. The flight had departed on time. He had arrived in San Francisco. These were the facts of the afternoon. They required no elaboration and no audience and no telling. They were simply what had happened, and what had happened was already finished and did not need to be carried anywhere. The duffel bag went on the hook by the door. The mandarin collar jacket went on the hanger in the closet. Dinner was ready. His children were at the table. The afternoon was over. In row 22 of a United Airlines flight that had now landed and deplaned and been cleaned and prepared for its next departure, a United States Navy SEAL was walking through the San Francisco terminal with his hand in his pocket. The hand that had opened and closed all the way from Los Angeles. The hand that remembered something that the rest of him was still in the process of understanding. He would take it out of his pocket later that evening and look at it one more time in the light of wherever he was staying, and it would look exactly like it always looked. Large and capable and trained and certain, and he would put it back in his pocket and try to sleep. And before he slept, he would think one more time about 2 fingers and a thumb and 45 degrees, and a small man in a dark jacket who had been standing in an aisle with a boarding pass that said 14A and had not moved and had not raised his voice and had not performed anything for anyone, and had simply waited for the situation to resolve itself into what it was always going to resolve itself into. Which it did. Which it always does. When the man holding the boarding pass understands something that the man sitting in the seat does not.